Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi to the good people, and welcome to another episode of A Fork in Time podcast. I like how I worked that into the very beginning without even having somebody throw to me. This is Chris Capola. I am joined by Eric Rush. Do you want to say an introduction, Eric?
Hi to the good people.
All right. So today we're going to build more on this Eisenhower ball of wax that I think we've all really fallen in love with this. I think we've really, have all really found this pretty interesting. And thank you, Eric, for, providing the medical bona fides for us to go down this route. So today's episode, we kind of thought, or I had the idea that this would be the foreign policy episode. This would be dealing with the United States in the world, and then we sat down and decided that that was a little ambitious in and of itself, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot. This is a really busy time in U.S. history, and I think there's a lot going on both in domestic and foreign policy. And Chris, you and Dylan and Don did a great job with the domestic policy, and I think it's a ripe topic for discussion of foreign policy and I think we decided between about 1956 and 1960 something.
63-ish, kind of
63-ish. Yeah.
But the other thing is there's this really interesting interconnectedness of topics. So that's one part of it, but the other part of it is this, at least the foreign policy topics we're thinking about today were a little more Euro/Soviet centric.
Sure.
There's more coming in the third world, and we're not going to tease, we're not going to tell you which country, but the country that you're all thinking about right now isn't going to make it into this one.
So keep listening.
Yes, come back to that one. Hopefully, I won't have to call anybody out like I did on the last episode by name, making sure Eric would be involved in this episode for the space race portion.
And so, if I could have a brief aside, I was planning on being on the record tonight, but if I had any trepidation or any conflict about being involved in tonight's episode, I was listening on my daily constitutional. And I was listening to it, and Chris was very kind to call me out and say, and by the way, I know Eric Rush is going to be there for this next episode. And I was like, oh, yeah, I definitely want to be there for that. So it was good.
And so, of course, we're going to make sure that the part he's specifically here for is at the very end. So you have to listen to everything else to get there.
Right.
So going through our timeline, the first big issue comes almost immediately after the passing of Eisenhower in what we determined was 55, right?
So it would been 56.
Okay.
If I remember right. So
okay.
In 1956, he had a very large, that's a good question. He had several heart attacks.
Okay.
And so we could pick one. And so we could pick anywhere between about September of 55 and we'll call it June of 56.
Okay.
Constitutionally, it does not matter. In all those cases, then over half the term had been served. And so Vice President Nixon was both able to take over, to take power as president, but then also to run for 2 terms and in his own right. So that is important. And so my reading of, sorry, go ahead.
Call it a June 56?
Yeah, September.
Here's the problem with
Well, okay, let's call it June because I see where you're going next, and that's actually important. So let's call it June.
Well, where do you think? Because I don't know. I had a really weird one going next, but what's your issue?
Well, I think it has to do with sort of some post heart attack complications.
Okay.
And so like I'm putting my alternate history cap off, like I'm taking it off and I'm looking at this entirely as a physician. So I don't know that there is necessarily a bright line. So I think you could easily pick anywhere between September 55 and probably up until a few weeks before Election Day of 56.
Okay.
And I think you'd be in pretty fertile ground there.
The reason I was saying June 56 is this.
Mm-hmm.
This is a different time somewhat in American politics.
Yeah.
There are no presidential primaries where there may be some for the 1956 presidential election, but Eisenhower is not formally nominated until the actual Republican convention, which
was in August, right?
Right.
That's okay. Interesting. So, okay, I'm on board with this. So let's say it's June.
I by the way, I promise we're going to get to foreign policy. I promise we're getting out of this domestic stuff
we are
at
getting
some point.
Well, and so to the listeners, like Chris and I had a very extensive, pre-podcast discussion, and it was great. Like,
oh, I loved it. It was wonderful.
It was wonderful, but there's so many things that are transparent to you as the listeners that happen behind the scenes, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do the live stream with YouTube, because to me that's fun, and I think Chris and I always have a really fun time doing that. So let's call it June of 1956. Let's say he dies, and whether it's another heart attack or whether it is a different complication such as bowel obstruction, which he did have. Okay. And so there's a number of things that happened to Eisenhower, all of which in 1956 had a pretty significant mortality rate. Okay. In 2022, not as high, but in 1956, high mortality rate. So let's just say, for argument's sake, and because it works out with our timeline, he passes in June of 56. Okay. And so what do? You have a sitting vice president in Richard Nixon, who is a person that we know very well in this podcast. And so then he needs to be nominated. And so in August of 56, presumably, and I actually feel very confident in this. And I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think in this instance, I think Nixon would get the nomination in a cakewalk in 56 with those circumstances. I think he does too, because he is the sitting president under this scenario. He is the vice president, elected vice president, who is the sitting president. And if we want to invoke very early parts in our country, at worst, he's acting president. This happened in after William Henry Harrison died. There was an acting president. Constitutionally, I don't know that really matters. And by 1953 or 1956, it clearly doesn't matter. So Nixon is the president, right? And he wins the election in 1956 in a cakewalk against somebody. I mean, Adlai Stevenson, who, for argument's sake. Well, again, that's the other thing about this happening in June. Everything else has been leading up to our timeline. So I don't know if the Democratic convention is radically different than it was in ours. So I think the answer to that is no. Right. Because it was such a shock. Right. However, right until that election is a month that we did talk about, and it's almost my favorite month in history. I love this month because you have two huge crises
crises that really do generate from completely different factors. And it just so happens they blow up during the exact same week. So do you want to deal with the first one, Eric, or your personal favorite one of the two?
Go ahead with yours, and I'll go ahead with mine.
Okay. The biggest one, or the one that gets a lot of the press, is the Suez Crisis of 1956, and this was basically an attempt by Israel, Great Britain, and France to overthrow Nasser in Egypt, who had started making friendly noises to the Soviets, who had been accepting Soviet aid, who was starting to go that route. What happened is Israel used some cross-border raids as a provocation to invade the Sinai, to go right up to the Suez Canal. The British and the French then stepped in and said, we need to have a ceasefire. We will go in to enforce a ceasefire. The thing is, from the very beginning, the Israelis were working with the British and French to cause the crisis, which would justify them taking over the Suez. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair.
And then the other important thing is, in our timeline, Eisenhower in the United States knew about it ahead of time, had told them this was a bad idea, and publicly worked with the Soviet Union to isolate these three nations and to basically force Britain and France to withdraw from the canal.
Right.
Correct. Okay.
No, I think that's right. And there is a part of me, and again, I'm an American, that feels like there was a little bit of motivated reasoning to humble the British and French, because it was a new world order. This was a bit of a Pax Americana, and so I think there was a sense that we needed the British and French to understand who is really running things.
And the other thing, and we'll deal with this in our next foreign policy Eisenhower episode more so, I think this was an attempt by the United States to secure some anti-colonial bona fides that we didn't stick with.
Mm-hmm.
If we would have stuck with that policy of encouraging national self-determination in the third world, I think that changes a lot of things. But we'll get to that in another episode. The other thing that happens at exactly the same time is the Hungarian Rising, the Budapest Uprising of 1956, which was there were others, but one of the first major efforts by nations on the other side of the Iron Curtain to expel or to renegotiate the deal with the Soviet Union.
Sure.
The United States, through Radio Free Europe, made statements that if you rise, we will support you. And then we didn't. And that, really basically established a U.S. policy of respecting the Iron Curtain in Europe. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, I think that's absolutely fair.
How does Nixon change those two policies, those two events?
Oh God, gosh, I think, Chris, I don't think Nixon's policy inside the Iron Curtain would change all that much.
Okay.
I think Nixon would very much still respect the Iron Curtain.
Okay.
But I also think Nixon would feel a little more empowered than Kennedy did. So if we can look at this a couple of different ways. We can look at this as Nixon in fulfilling the second half of the Eisenhower term.
Mhm.
And we can look at this as Nixon in the early 1960s. And so I think Nixon in the late 1950s, in the second half of Eisenhower's term, is going to be very much a continuation of that policy.
Okay.
And that includes an anti-communist stance that had some nuance, because Eisenhower had to prove nothing to anybody.
Mhm.
And it is 2022, and Eisenhower still has nothing to prove to anybody. He is Dwight Eisenhower. He is the general who led the invasion in Normandy. Like, he will forever be honored in the annals of American history. And that's not undeserved. And so there's a lot about Eisenhower that is never going to be second guessed. Whereas Nixon had some of those coattails, but he also had some very clear bona fides as an anti-communist.
Mhm.
Nobody ever doubted Nixon as being anti-communist, ever. And so then you had what that gives you is not a hardline policy, because Eisenhower nor Nixon were hardliners. They were mainstream conservatives. Whereas Kennedy was we'll call him a moderate progressive. Kennedy was a bit of a chameleon. I don't know that we really know, other than his rhetoric, what Kennedy's policy was. But so let's assume a few things, and let's assume that Eisenhower and Nixon were ardently anti-communist, and everybody agreed with this. So Kennedy had to react against that and be more anti-communist and be less nuanced than Nixon or Eisenhower did. And so I think in the case of the Nixon administration in the late 1950s, 1960s, I think you have a President Nixon who is much more empowered to make nuanced policy, not because it plays to the press and not because it makes him look like a more dedicated anti-communist, because he didn't need that, but because he felt like that's what needed to be done. And I say this, I am no Nixon supporter, but I still think this is true, that I think Nixon would give the ability for a more nuanced response to this incursion of the Iron Curtain.
What about the other incident? What would Nixon be doing during the Suez Crisis? Would that have been a different role than the Eisenhower role?
I don't know that it would. I think that the U.S. State Department and the government at large saw Suez as an opportunity.
Okay.
And that opportunity was to make the Western European allies understand that they are subordinate within NATO to the U.S. And I say this with apologies to any sort of European friends who are listening, but I really think that part of Suez was a deliberate humiliation against the British and French, because they wanted to make sure that they stayed in the fold.
Okay.
And, because they weren't going to go to the Warsaw Pact. Like, that was not going to happen. The worst that would happen is they would go the Austria or Ireland route and be neutral. And so I think that there was an aspect of this that was part of shaming the UK and France into coming in line with the US. Say, you went too far this time. You went too far, and so you need to come back. And that may have been true for the Israelis as well. But I also think, like, so much of our contact with the Israelis is, I'm going to call it under the table.
Okay.
And that may be a bit unfair, but we'll just say more subtle negotiations with our Israeli friends.
Okay. Just thinking about the basic plan here, I thought I looked at it and said that's got Nixon all over it. This is if the British and French didn't come up with this, this is the kind of thing that a Nixon would have come up with. And even given, his experience in our timeline, he didn't necessarily draw and respect borders. So I think
I agree. I agree with Chris. I think that's a really interesting perspective. And so, what would that look like?
I think what that looks like is the linkage of these two things.
Okay,
the linkage of these two crises. The reason, by the way, militarily, the British and French were able to go in and they did occupy Suez. The reason this fell apart and the reason this failed is because the Soviet Union and the United States cooperated at the United Nations to basically apply the political pressure that made their position untenable.
True.
Nixon is a horse trader. He is a man that makes deals. And I think in this circumstance, there is a linkage between Suez and Hungary.
I can see that.
I think Nixon, even if he has no intention of actually encouraging a Hungarian uprising, I think giving that up to the Soviets, communicating to the Soviets that this will not be our policy, you will have a free hand here as long as you give us a free hand in Egypt. I think that's a very Nixonian thing to do. So I think in our timeline, it's a possibility that he communicates with Khrushchev and makes a deal, gives up something which, by the way, we both agreed he had no use for. He had no intention of actually encouraging Hungary to break away.
Agreed.
But you know what? You might as well get something for giving it up.
I think that is entirely possible with Nixon. I agree, Chris. I think the wrinkle is what would that be? Like, what is that? And how would Nasser react to that?
I think Nasser is in our timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Nasser is about as well known as Mossadegh.
Okay.
I think because even in our timeline, Nasser is brilliant, and he is brilliant for playing the superpowers off against each other, and very much
particularly the British.
He is largely the person who wags the dog. He does. He plays the two superpowers off, but in this circumstance, he's left holding the bag by the Soviets.
Well, by the Soviets and Americans, if depending on in this timeline. But
in this case, the Americans are supporting the British and French.
Well, okay, so I should say,
and the Soviets hang him out to dry in exchange for the free hand in Hungary.
True. Okay, that's totally fair. Totally fair. And I think that is that will prompt a very different Middle East in the rest of the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yes. I think that's a really interesting discussion, removing Nasser at this point. The thing we haven't discussed is what replaces him.
Nasser? Ooh.
Yes.
In Egypt?
Egypt, and that is going to determine a lot of other things.
So in Egypt, it's always going to be the military.
Okay.
Whenever there is a political leader that is deposed or
Mhm.
is unsustainable in some ways, either overtly or covertly, the military has stepped in.
Okay.
Because the army in Egypt is very well respected, and I think in some ways for very good reasons. And so I think you have a military takeover of Egypt if the situation becomes untenable.
So we pick another colonel, because keeping in mind, Nasser has only been there about 3 years.
Yeah, but
in whatever capacity.
Yep.
I do think the United States, and this is important, the United States does play a bigger role in picking the successor, because the British, having already, having recently been very involved there, were very close to the old king.
True. And at this point, the prime minister is Anthony Eden, who is very a fluent Arabic speaker, who is very interested in Middle Eastern affairs. And so I think the resolution of that in favor of Britain, but also in favor of the area with somebody who understands the politics and culture better, is dependent on him being around for a while.
Okay.
Which in our timeline, he wasn't. He had a lot of
Eden.
He had a lot of liver and gallbladder issues, and ended up getting his gallbladder removed in the U.S. when he was on a visit. So Anthony Eden had a lot of health problems, and he was a younger guy, and but had a lot of issues that really, I think, diluted his ability to be effective.
Okay. So to chase this a little bit further, we have another colonel.
Yeah.
What does that do to the core relationship between both Egypt and the West and Egypt and Israel?
So I think that the impact on Egypt and the West and Egypt and Israel, and I would even say I would fold Israel into the West.
Okay.
And because there is I feel like, in many ways I hope that the US has a kind of pro-Israel and pro-Jewish sentiment to it overall. And so my hope is that you would pick a successor, your new colonel, that would be acceptable to the US, but also acceptable specifically to the UK, France, and Israel.
Okay.
And so you have a person who is military, but is also pro-democratic and is liberal-ish at the very least, or what we would understand is as liberal-ish, which is probably politically middle of the road for us, but at least understands and respects the policies and the tradition of liberal democracy. I think it'd be very easy to get that, to want that person. Like, who that person is, I don't know.
I mean, in my mind, I would just use the name of Sadat.
Well, okay, so we can talk about Sadat.
Especially because he was somebody who had kind of realized by the time he does come in how destructive the Soviet relationship had been. And he came in and very much wanted to make peace from the very beginning, from the moment he took over. So by the way, I don't think that the West would have been troubled with anything you just said in terms of respect for liberal democracy, terms of anything like that. And we want somebody who is going to secure the canal.
Yeah, totally. And I'm, I love, we are not unbiased here on A Fork in Time. Like at the end, like I am an American who is very pro liberal democracy. Like that is who I am. Like and so I am always going to, side with that. And we don't get political. Like I'm not trying to give away like my R or D behind my name or anything like that. But just to say that I am an American who embraces liberal democracy and self-determination. And so when I say things like that, or when I talk about those things like that, like I am absolutely allowing my bias to shine forth. And and that's fine. Like bias isn't bad. It's just as long as we call it out, as long as we understand what it is and call it out, like it's okay. And that, we have a very savvy listenership, and I trust the listenership to listen to me and say, yeah, this is legit or this is not. Like, yeah, I agree. I agree with Eric, or like this Rush Turkey is like, he's off, he's off the rails. Like that's okay. That's all okay.
So I think they do put it in a kernel.
I think they put it in a kernel.
They build the dam. They actually approve it.
I think they build the dam. I think that was inevitable at that point.
And the other interesting thing is, do they break the 3 no's?
Which are?
No negotiation, no recognition, no peace with Israel. I always like this idea of the West kind of deciding, listen, we're going to use Egypt as a case example of what happens if you play ball with us. We're going to build projects for them. We're going to provide them support. Again, they do not have the other Soviet involvement, so they can't wag us. But we can use Egypt as a case study. And by the way, since this is so early in the process, you don't have decades of the people in charge in Egypt using Israel as a boogeyman.
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
So I think it's distinctly possible you have a treaty recognizing the state, and Egypt gets the Sinai back.
Okay. I can get behind that. And so you have, so you have a Camp David Accords, essentially in 1956.
I'm gonna say like 58, 59, because there's some processes that need to play out here.
It's going to take a minute.
Yeah.
So, but earlier, so you've got
very much earlier.
You've got a Camp David Accords that were negotiated by Carter in the 70s, that were instead navigated by Nixon in the late 50s.
Yes.
That is not nothing. Like, that is a pretty big deal.
That is huge.
It's a pretty big deal.
It especially because thinking about what Nasser meant to the Arab world.
Yes.
And thinking about what does that do, obviously there's no 6-day war or a very different conflict.
Probably not. I mean, I'm thinking about the ferocity of the 6-day war and what an existential crisis that was for Israel. And
if they've got peace on the Sinai,
that then they've got one of their fronts totally covered that they don't have to worry about. And I look at this, and I look at this also in the idea, like, at this point, Israel probably had nuclear weapons.
By the way, just to be perfectly clear, at what point?
Well, so we're saying 67, 73. We think
Okay.
and they're undeclared, and like for anybody, like all the people from the U.S. State Department that are listening to this podcast, like I have no inside knowledge, and I'm not a spy for anybody, but I'm pretty certain by 67 Israel has nuclear weapons. But and I think their decision to not deploy them in our current timeline was narrow. I think it was a very close call.
I agree with you in the context of 73.
Well, okay, so I'll put it at 73. I think 67 or 73 could play in.
I think in 67, I agree that they had that capability, but the fact is,
they would have employed it at that point.
From the very beginning of 67, things were going their way.
Okay, so 73, things were not going their way as much, for sure.
Right.
And so we'll just say that was more likely that they would employ it at that point. Okay, I can get behind that, Chris. I can get behind that.
And the other interesting thing is you also have the role of Jordan as a relatively pro-Western monarchy. Now we just have Syria as, I mean, if you've got Egypt that has peace, Jordan very quickly makes peace.
Yeah.
Because they're not worried about the Arab street. Maybe you actually do not have an occupation and have a lasting two-state solution.
Oh, interesting. Well, I mean, that would solve a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, listeners at home, this is not, looking at the list, this was like the first of like 4 things we were going to talk about. But we got a really interesting one done, I think.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a several-part episode. But I mean,
okay.
The good news is for everybody who's listening, like there's a lot to keep Chris and I out of trouble for the next few weeks.
So let's get to the next, huge thing we were thinking about. Cuba. Okay. You and I have already done Cuba episodes, but just to breeze through it.
Not in this way.
No.
So you had Batista, and Batista was in charge of Cuba until the late 1950s, and then we initially supported Castro.
Yes.
For in the U.S., because he seemed to resolve some issues that we had with Cuba, and yet he created so many more. And so, would we have reacted differently in a different administration? And a lot of this happened under Eisenhower. So you had Eisenhower that was in our current timeline until 1961. And so would that first couple of years of Cuba have been different under a President Nixon? And I think the answer is essentially no. Okay. I think Nixon would have reacted very similarly to Cuba. I think he might have asked for a few more assurances
from Castro for the support.
Yes.
Okay.
And because I think Eisenhower comes at this from Eisenhower's a big picture guy. He was a 5-star general. Like he supported and administered a lot of different people. And so I think he was a big picture guy. And so I think there's a lot less detail that Eisenhower needed compared to Nixon. And I think some of this is personality between Eisenhower and Nixon, and some of this is sort of like some of this is training. So Eisenhower, 5-star general in the U.S. Army, Nixon, a lieutenant commander in the Navy. And so when you're a lieutenant commander, like you are much more focused on the day to day and the
Mhm.
detail. And so I think that's where Nixon would be focused. I think he would look
Okay.
at this far more in the detail than Eisenhower did. And so you might end up with a somewhat different Cuba. Do I think it's going to be radically different? No. Do I think that Batista was a viable leader of Cuba? No.
Okay.
But you might have ended up with a much more pan-nationalistic Castro,
Okay.
as opposed to a communist Castro. And
Okay.
well, and let's even say Che Guevara too. So let's say the whole, kind of the whole group there. Let's say that we are looking at this from the perspective of being anti-Batista.
Mhm.
That's a big camp. There are a lot of reasons to not like Batista, and most of them are not communism.
Okay.
And so, let's say that the U.S. government leans into some of those.
And so, are you saying in the immediate aftermath of Castro's takeover,
Mm-hmm.
Castro still takes over?
I think Batista is done by
Okay.
late 58.
Okay.
And so I think a Castro or somebody like Castro at that point is inevitable.
Okay. So in the immediately post-revolutionary or post-takeover period, you think the United States tries to influence Castro to sideline Guevara and other
More revolutionary aspects. Yeah, maybe.
right.
I could see that.
Okay.
I could see that.
You know where I think the line comes?
Mm-hmm.
The line comes in 1960-61 when the United States implements its anti-Castro operation with full force and without any of the strictures put on it by the, in our timeline, Kennedy administration.
Yeah.
I hate to be the dark one. I hate to, I feel like you're always, we're going to go and establish liberal democracies. And I'm like, coup, overthrow them, go in and just bomb them.
Well, and this is my bias. Like it's hard for me to not let my bias show. And my bias is like I want the whole world to be a liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean the liberal in the the US progressive standpoint. I just mean in the general self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
Like obviously, like I am an American. I grew up in the United States. I've been in the United States my whole life. I have a very strong democratic tradition. And so, so Chris is right. Like I'm always going to have this like liberal democracy bias because that is my bias. Because I think the world is better that way.
And I'm not saying it's not. I'm just coming at this from a
You're just saying sometimes it doesn't work out that way.
It's I mean, we're talking about the president that did like Allende coup.
Oh yeah, no, you're right.
15 years later, like
no, you're right.
This is not a consideration for the man. Just being honest.
I get it. Well, and Chris, you are often my gut check on this to like be like, Eric, sometimes the thing that you want to happen doesn't always happen. Like and I have to acknowledge, like, yep, you're right about that, Chris. Sometimes it doesn't happen.
So, but do you agree that like which of those two things do you think soft pressure on Castro, or does he say, thank you, that's nice, and keep going ahead?
It's Nixon. Nixon is, and Nixon is always going to be a blunt instrument. And I don't even say this as being a person who is entirely anti-Nixon. Like, this may be heresy among our readership. I am not completely anti-Nixon. There are some good things about Nixon. There are some things he did as president that are really good. And so, like, on balance, I am not pro-Nixon, but like, I am nuanced in that approach. And I understand sort of who he is. And so I think he would, in this case, he would take a hard line, because I also think he is a president who does not want communist influence 90 miles off of Florida. And you know what? Neither do I.
So we probably overthrow Castro in 61.
Probably. I could see so 60 is an election year.
Yes.
And it is a transition of administrations from Eisenhower to Kennedy. So
in ours.
In our timeline.
But the reason I say 61 is generally, I think largely the policy and the development of the Cuban Revolution follows our timeline.
Totally fair. But I would say from a purely pragmatic standpoint, it's also in this timeline, as opposed to the current timeline, it is an administration inflection point.
Okay.
So in the alternate timeline, there is no inflection point. It is a re-election of Richard Nixon and a continuation of administration policies. That comes with a lot of administrative inertia.
Okay.
So any sort of operations, such as a Bay of Pigs, will be able to proceed accordingly, as compared to an administrative transition between Eisenhower and Kennedy that we experienced within our timeline, which was not entirely smooth.
And that's the point, is that transition went in and started changing that initial plan.
It wasn't, and I don't even think it was abnormal. Like, I don't even think the transition between Nick or Eisenhower and Kennedy was unusual, but it was a transition. And then I think, you had transitions between, so I think you had between Johnson and Nixon, and then, Ford and Carter and Reagan. And I would say that those, as far as I can tell, were fairly normal transitions. It was a relatively, even considering political party, it was a relatively seamless transition of power within the U.S. This is the optimal way our system is designed. And so we hope that and we have no reason to suspect that in 1965, would we think this would happen, that would happen any differently. So I think we have a pretty seamless 1961. It was very different.
I think so. The operation proceeds as it was originally planned. Castro is overthrown, and Cuba becomes
a U.S. vassal, either de facto or de jure. It becomes our possession as it once was.
I mean, thinking about 65, it's a very little known event, but the invasion of the Dominican Republic in 65.
True.
We went in and played this in a couple of different countries, and I think we had done it in Cuba plenty. The key is, if we remove Castro in 61, there is no missile crisis. Now, here's an interesting question, which comes to mind now, and I promise we didn't discuss this off podcast, and we're about to get a hot take on this.
Okay.
There's no missile crisis in 63. Khrushchev has a handshake agreement with Nixon, recognizing the Iron Curtain. Does Khrushchev politically survive after 65?
Oh, okay. So I actually have some feelings about this.
Yeah.
So I feel like the missile crisis really crippled Khrushchev.
Yes.
And so I think he survives a while longer.
In a way that losing a Cuba that he doesn't even necessarily have doesn't.
Yeah, and so
nobody is standing up in the Politburo accusing Khrushchev as being the man that lost us Cuba.
Right, and so I think you have a number of people who were essentially nationalists, and so we can talk about Castro. I would talk about Ho Chi Minh here too, who were not ardent capitalists, but who were nationalists for their own people. And so I think in 1958 to 1960, 61, I think it is a pitched battle for who Fidel Castro is.
Okay.
And so at that point, earlier on, I don't think you have necessarily the idea that a Khrushchev would lose Cuba. I think Cuba was considered up for grabs. I think that it is later in 62, after it is apparent that Cuba has been, and I'm going to use the word seized, but that's not a fair word. We'll just say power has been consolidated by Castro. By 62, that the loss of Cuba would then be felt and would be a political handicap to Khrushchev.
Right.
So I agree, Chris. I think if there is an early takeover of Cuba and there is no Cuban Missile Crisis, I think Khrushchev survives for a while longer. What is that? What does that mean? Does that mean 1970? Yeah, it's possible.
Okay.
But a while longer. And so then you have the idea: is there a Leonid Brezhnev that results in the 70s as a function of that? And I don't know if that's true. I think by the time Khrushchev would be forced to step down, because eventually he would be.
Would he? Think about this: Khrushchev and Gorbachev were the only two Soviet leaders to not leave office feet first.
That is true. I'm thinking about this, and you're exactly right. And I think in some ways that was by design.
Okay.
And so I think you had Khrushchev, and I think you had Brezhnev, and then you had Andropov and Chernenko, who I think were both designed to die in office ineffectually.
Okay.
I don't think either of them was designed to be in any way contributory to any sort of agenda.
Okay.
And as it turns out, they really didn't. I think you had, so Brezhnev died in 82?
Yeah,
and
I think
Gorbachev took over at 85.
Yes.
And so you have 3-ish years, and you had 2 Soviet premiers within that time. And I'm going to challenge you to this, Chris, because you know more about this stuff than almost 100% of the population. Like, tell me about what Khrushchev and Andropov did in that 3 years that was substantive. Like, tell me about their policies.
So Khrushchev does have substantive policies. Chernenko and Andropov.
I said Khrushchev. I meant Chernenko and Andropov. So tell me about any of their policies.
Their policies were just a continuation of
Brezhnev. Anti-Stalinization. So they're
no, I don't think it was de-Stalinization. I think in a way it was almost re-Stalinization.
Because they were
from a dynamic confronting the West, pounding his shoe on his table, Khrushchev.
Okay. I can see that.
In that these other people had survived Stalin in very much that sense that if you're a nail that sticks out, you get your head cut off.
True.
So I think those Soviet leaders were very similar to Chinese leaders between Mao and Xi Jinping, where there is kind of a culture of collective leadership. There may be somebody in charge. Somebody has to be the name, but things move very slowly. And there is a consensus within the Politburo before any decisions happen. But the big issue, like we talked about with Khrushchev, is if there's no Cuba, he survives. And a Khrushchev in charge means different decisions on the part of the Soviet Union than if you do have a Brezhnev in charge.
I completely agree. I think that's right. They were very different personalities.
So you have a Soviet Union moving into the 60s, moving into the later 60s, that is more openly challenging the West.
Yes. And so, okay, Chris, I am going to call this our endpoint for the evening. And I'm going to say that we have a Khrushchev that is setting us up for not détente in the 70s.
Okay.
And so you have a 1970s that is now set up for more conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be cold conflict. I don't think it's going to be hot conflict. I think at worst there's going to be proxy wars.
I think there's going to be a lot more proxy wars, though.
Proxy wars. Yeah, I agree. There's proxy wars. And P.S. by the way, is Ronald Reagan is still governor of California. He has not come on to this.
Are you saying they're going to invade Berkeley or?
Not Berkeley. But we should come back to that. But because I think you have a really interesting setup. I think you have a Khrushchev still into, let's say, the early 70s.
By the way, he did die in the early 70s himself.
Yeah, so he died in 72. And so we're not going to change that.
We might move it up a little bit just because his last 7 years, he's in retirement. He's the only I hate to say this. Khrushchev seems a little bit like one of those the one mob boss to actually survive to retirement.
Well,
to hand it over.
He's Benedict the 16th.
He actually. No, I'm not. He hands it over and he retires. He's living in a dacha, enjoying that retirement. So maybe him still being in charge pushes that date up a little bit into 1970. But even then, those 5 years are really important and really critical.
Yeah. So I will say, I will say this as a person with the Catholic tradition that is very much Benedict the 16th. To retire to your dacha, whether that's in Moscow or that's in Rome, doesn't really matter.
Okay.
It is. You get to live out your dotage in significant comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe maybe that route is not so bad. But in this case, we are making a decision that will happen very differently.
Yes, that we'll have a Kennedy in 1964, and later on a Johnson, who are confronting Khrushchev.
Right, in the late 60s. Well, and I think by that point, presuming our mid 60s scandal with Kennedy, This is a Johnson versus Khrushchev.
Mm-hmm.
And I will be honest, if I have to pick amongst Nixon, Kennedy, and Johnson to go head to head against Khrushchev, I pick Johnson. He's a horse trader. He was in the Senate for a million years at that point. Like,
I agree.
He's not intimidated by anybody.
I agree with that. I think Nixon's a very close second. I'm thinking about the kitchen debate.
And I agree. And I don't want to underestimate Nixon. Like, Nixon's a very different personality. He's a shrewd negotiator. I think there is a more aggressive stance compared to a more strategic stance amongst the three of them. But I think we can both agree that amongst the three of them, Kennedy is the weakest.
Yes. And the interesting thing is, so much of what happens in the 60s, early 60s, with the Berlin crisis and with the missiles in Cuba is, to some extent, Khrushchev trying to take advantage of Kennedy, seeing him as weak and pushing him.
Well, especially when it comes to some of the discussions in 1961.
Mm-hmm.
He saw Kennedy as a stuffed shirt.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not fair. Like, Kennedy was much more than that. And so I don't agree with this idea that Kennedy was a sort of a non-entity.
Mm-hmm.
I do think Kennedy was more substantive than that. But having said that, I also think that both Nixon and Johnson would have been more aggressive and productive negotiators.
And so when we come back to this episode,
yes,
because we haven't even finished what we were.
Well,
first we cut the entire foreign policy. First, we cut.
We're going to have to split this episode because I need to go to sleep because I have to go to work tomorrow.
First we cut the foreign policy down. Then we did cut what we were going to do for foreign policy down to just this. But when we come back to this, here's something we're going to think about.
Okay.
We still have Khrushchev in power in 1964 through 66. He is still confronting Kennedy for 2 years. What form does that take? It doesn't take the form of Cuba.
No.
Berlin is a perennial crisis, so that's always a possibility.
Eastern Europe, hotspots, maybe Central Asia.
There's also, you're right, Southern Asia. Mm-hmm. There's an Indo-Pakistani war about now.
Correct.
There's Congo, which I think takes on a very different importance.
We could do a whole episode on Congo. Congo is, the Congo region is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
There are the leaders are all really nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes in a good way, sometimes in not such a good way. But the Congo is a fascinating part of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. But we will come back to this. So
we definitely will.
I want to encourage everybody to tell us to provide more gut checks to us, if you don't mind, to go on to our Discord server. Let us know if you have different thoughts. I've actually seen, as we've been recording this, a couple of thoughts coming in on there. We'd love to hear from you. Get involved on the website, aforkandtimepodcast.com. That's how both of us got involved in this. We'd love to hear from more people. And until next episode, this is Chris and Eric Rush signing off.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.